Okay, so now we got to close out the day, at least where our talks are concerned. We got Dr. Dave Notter, and again, I've introduced him and reminded everybody the contributions he's made to the sheep industry as a whole, nationally and internationally. You know, we had a couple other names mentioned today, colleagues that Dave worked with for many years, Dr. Dave Thomas and Dr. Craig Lymaster, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Notter be able to come here today in person to visit with us. This is an honor, and like I said, not only for Katahdin producers, the value that it's had for the industry in terms of its breeding values that Tom introduced, but again, all sheep industry, and he's had a huge impact on the program at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station. So again, it's great to have him here. And with that, Dr. Notter, I'll turn it over to you and kick the lights.
Okay, thank you.
Hold on, let me get this over to you. Everything.
Okay, you good? Well, it's a real pleasure to be here at the station. I haven't been here for well over a year, and I haven't been anywhere for well over a year. But it's really nice to be back in Idaho, and especially to get an opportunity to talk about to this group of Katahdin breeders. Let's start with some basics, and I found some of this is going to be repetitive, which is good. When I think talked about production goals, and I've defined those as production objectives, but very quickly, it's the same thing. Why are you in the sheep business? What is it you're trying to accomplish? Now, that's not something you think about every day, because you never get anything done if you spend all your time thinking about that. But maybe about once a year when you go out to the barn during lambing and there aren't a bunch of ewes that you need to attend to, maybe every once in a while you need to think about, what am I doing this for? Is this the way I want to make my living? Maybe. Is this something I want to do because I've got 30 acres of grass and feel like I ought to do something with it? Maybe. Is this something I think I'm doing for my kids? Don't ever ask them that question. Just do it. Is this something I think I'm doing for my kids so that they will learn about agriculture and responsibility of animals? What is this about? Nobody gets to judge you on your production objective. It's yours. You also probably need to think about what are your mating system. Again, that's been touched on. Do you really want to be predominantly producing Katahdin seed stock animals, or are the Katahdin simply a means to an end that you have chosen for your commercial sheep enterprise? If you're a seed stock breeder, it doesn't really matter. You know what you do. Now you get to think about what your customers do and how you're going to produce animals that meet your customers' needs, because you've probably already figured out if you don't meet your customers' needs, they don't come back, no matter how much you think they should. So these are some things that come into the beginning of thinking about what your breeding program is going to be like. Then we come to the main topic of the presentation today, which is the breeding objective. And this is something you might think about very frequently. How do I develop the genetics I've chosen to use, the breed resources I've chosen to use to meet my production objective? If you're Katahdin seed stock breeders and you aspire to produce replacement ewe lambs for rangeland producers, how do I develop the genetics that will make me successful in that endeavor? And it's best done by focusing on factors that will control the costs and returns in your situation and your customer's situation. It's an accounting exercise, and we all know how much fun accounting exercises can be, but it's an important part of any business to know what are the things you can change in your sheep that will make you money, and what are the changes you want to avoid changing because they will, or could change, they might cost you money. And I think particularly of importance for this group at this session is how many different breeding objectives are needed to meet the goals of Katahdin sheep in different places and for different kinds of producers. Are you able to be a part of a national program of Katahdin breeders who have largely compatible breeding goals? Or are you going to need to take those breeding goals that are sort of typical of the national Katahdin flock and modify them, finesse them, develop them to better address the needs of your local customers? Coming with that, do you aspire to market breeding stock nationally? Or will you be more impactful focusing your animals on a regional breeding stock market? I can't answer that question for you, nor would I attempt to, but hopefully we can help you to answer that with some of the thoughts we'll bring out today. I don't know if there's anything we can do about that top line, but it's not that important to miss. The breeding objective was a concept defined by Hazel in 1943. It's a function, as you can see here in the middle of the screen. It's a function of the breeding values of your sheep for each trait in the breeding objective. It's defined specifically as the effect of a 1-unit change in animal breeding value for each trait, holding the breeding value for all the other traits constant. So in terms of that equation, if I could change weaning weight by 1 unit genetically and nothing else, would that make me money or cost me money? And if so, how much? If I could change number of lambs weaned by 1 unit and change nothing else in the breeding objective, how much money would that hopefully make me? And those numbers, those weightings tell you the relative importance of the genetic traits that are available to you for selection. And to state the obvious, you want to put most of your selection emphasis on the numbers that are most impactful. You also want to recognize, as you mentioned earlier, that there are some traits that are not sufficiently impactful that you care. And that's a hard thing for breeders to accept. We got all these EBVs. How do we use them all? Well, maybe we throw about 1/4 of them away because they aren't impactful for us in our production system. That's a big part of this process. Now, the development of a breeding objective can be very intuitive with just a little bit of sort of simple accounting. If I get 1 more pound of weaning weight and that's worth whatever it's worth this year, then that's the extra return from that. And I deduct a little bit of the feed required to get that extra pound. And that's something like the value. In a lot of cases in the last few years, we've used larger bioeconomic models that attempt to predict the impact of all of these traits on costs and returns, including things like ewe maintenance requirements, premiums for large muscle area, if there were such a thing, discounts for overfat lambs, which there most certainly are such a thing. So we've tried to use those, but there are a number of ways to do this. The last thing I'll mention quickly, and maybe get to later, is breeding objectives are generally pretty robust over time, but eventually they can change. I'll give you some examples of that. And importantly, breeding objectives can be different for different production systems and production environments. Now, a term that may be more familiar to some of you is the selection index. That was also defined by Hazel in 1943. And it was a way that you could take the measurements you take on your animals, the phenotypes, and convert them to an index that is a best predictor of the breeding value. And that was a lot of work, frankly. And to make this a little bit shorter for purposes of time, in an era of EBVs, the selection index, with all its consideration of heritabilities and genetic correlations and number of observations, becomes moot. Because the EBVs that you get from NSIP can now, on the bottom line there, be put directly into the breeding value equation. So the EBVs are the best estimates available of the genetic values of each individual. That's what we want to use in the breeding value estimate. And so we can use those EBVs directly to predict the breeding values for the breeding objective for each animal in the flock. So it makes the mathematics of the selection index moot, which bothers probably a lot of people who spend tons of time to understand them, but it's a real boon to you guys. The nice thing also is that genetic evaluation methods to get EBVs are now available to scientists and producers anywhere in the world. All you got to do is make the commitment to collect the data. And the software and the skills are there to turn those data into EBVs. You can do it by yourself for your own animals if you're so inclined, but it's certainly a much better thing to do it in an association setting so that these sort of breed-wide genetic comparisons that Tom mentioned earlier will be available to you. Now, as we think about developing breeding objectives, and again, breeding objectives, selection index are now synonymous. The thing I use, the number I use to select my animals to maximize profit. We'll call it the breeding objective, but that's what it is. It gets complicated because in the USA, NSIP now provides at least 20 different EBVs that Katahdin breeders can use for growth, wool, reproduction, disease resistance, ultrasonic carcass traits, the whole gamut of things. If you go to Land Plan Australia, they have over 85 different traits that they include in their genetic improvement program. A lot of those are wool traits in merino sheep, where you can bail on those, but that's still a huge amount of stuff. So what traits should you consider in your breeding objective? Everything? All 20 or 25 traits? Or just a subset of traits that have direct effects on your profit and your return and your cost of production? I think you already know my answer. It's the second one. It's the latter. You need to decide what things matter, and you need to decide what things probably don't matter. For the Katahdin, we've got a great example. All the wool traits, they're off the table, aren't they? That simplifies things a lot. There are some other traits that might be off the table too. This is a list of the main categories of NSIP EBVs. On the left, mostly lamb production traits, birth weight, both the direct effect and the maternal effect, weaning weight, both the direct effect, the genetics of the lamb for growth, and the maternal effect, the genetics of the mother for things like milk production and mothering behavior that impact the lamb through the contribution of the mother. Post-weaning weight, it has a maternal component, but it's not very important anymore. Yearling weight, we also can do hogget or ewe breeding weights. For those of you who have concerns about the size and the maintenance requirements of your ewes, not very many breeders take advantage of that, but it's available to you. And ultrasonic measures of fat and muscle mass. On the more ewe side or fitness side, on the right there, we have a number of lambs born and weaned, looking at litter size and lamb survival. We have fecal egg counts. We have scrotal circumference in male lambs. We have the fiber array, which we're not going to talk about. If I were to look at what I think is the current emphasis in the Katahdin breed nationally, and from the little set of Katahdin flocks that were shown on the map, Katahdin breed nationally largely means sort of the middle latitude of the eastern half of the U.S., doesn't it? Kind of cross Missouri up the Ohio River, and then a few flocks scattered around below them in the south and southeast. If I look at what I see the Katahdin breeders in that sort of traditional, that traditional heartland includes, they're the ones I've got in green. Direct and maternal effects on birth weight, direct and maternal effects on weaning weight, number of lambs born and weaned, and fecal egg counts. The ones in blue, some things people are using and some things certain breeders think we should use more. Post-weaning weight. We don't place, I think most of the Katahdin breeders in the east and southeast aren't putting a ton of impact on post-weaning weight. Some think they really should. We'll get to that some more later. Scrotal circumference is a tool for predicting the reproductive performance of the daughters and the female relatives of those ram lambs. It's potentially informative. I realized as I was watching other people's slides, scrotal circumference is never in your breeding objective, right? Because do you care anything about the scrotal circumference of a ram separate from anything else? Probably doesn't cost you a cent unless you're doing high semen utilization AI, which you're not. We use scrotal circumference only to get a better predictor of the number born and number weaned in replacement ewe lambs. That's what's in your breeding objective. Scrotal circumference is just a tool to improve the accuracy of the evaluation of those animals for ewe reproductive traits, which is what we care about. Then we've got a set of traits in yellow, yearling weights and pocket breeding weights. Well, they might be important, but nobody's using them much. And ultrasonic loin muscle depth, some people think that's really important, and quite a few people are scanning Katahdins. A lot of them are scanning 50-pound weanling Katahdin lambs, and I don't think that tells me very much about muscle. Plus, most of the Katahdin flocks in the east are not getting paid for big loin mounts. There's just not a way to do it. Most of the sheep in the world are not getting paid for big ultrasonic loin mounts. That's a different issue. Now, if I were to think about how I might want to change these to put a more rangeland emphasis on the Katahdin breeding objective, these are the changes I might want to make. I might want to get post-weaning weight in green then, for some of the reasons Wick said about carcass weights that are desired by the lamb buyers in the region. So I may need to put some focus on the ability of Katahdins to continue to grow post-weaning and therefore fit the desires of feedlot production and heavyweight lamb production. I started to say demands, and I think desires is a better word. Ultrasonic loin muscle depth. Well, if we start measuring it in 100, 130-pound breeding rams, I might be more interested in it because you may come under criticism from the lamb buyers in the region about muscle. You may not. I think that's one of the reasons we have Katahdins at the station grow. And fecal egg counts, unless you are producing on irrigated pasture. Is anybody producing on irrigated pasture? Okay, you may need some attention to fecal egg counts, but if you're producing on an environment like the one outside, you may not care at all. And of course, that puts you in heavy-duty tension with the southeastern U.S. Katahdin breeders who care about that almost more than anything. Tension's not a bad thing. It's just tension, just decisions that have to be made. I don't think anybody's going to start doing many weightings of yearlings and hogs, so I would be glad to have a conversation with you if you wanted to. Okay, this is an example of a breeding objective for Targhee. And it's messy, but let me just walk you through it. Before I do that, let me say that the Targhee breeding objective is probably the most comprehensively developed, theoretically proper economic analysis we've done for any U.S. We put a lot of work into figuring out the costs and returns. And let's see, I don't have the, yeah, you can see the pointer, right? Yeah, okay. We did this a lot of different ways. We looked at possibly discounting lamb prices for heavy lambs or not. We looked at a high feed cost sort of Midwestern scenario, a low feed cost range scenario. But we can focus right here on the top line, low feed costs, undiscounted lamb prices. And these are relative net returns. So if I increase the weaning weight EBV, number of these things here, weaning weight, maternal milk, yearling weight, fleece weight, reduced fiber diameter, staple length, and percent lamb crop born. These are the 7 traits in the Targhee breeding objective. If we look at, these are all scaled by 1 additive standard deviation. So they're scaled for the fact that some traits are more heritable, some traits are more variable, some traits are easier to change, right? So they're scaled for that. And we find that in this scenario, increasing weaning weight or increasing percent lamb crop produces an increase in relative net returns of about 5%. It's the most important thing you can do. Increasing maternal milk is a little bit less efficient way to get heavier lambs, but it's still worthwhile. Increasing relative returns about 2%. Increasing fleece weight, reducing fiber diameter, about a 1% increase in returns. Staple length is a wash, it's not a problem. Had quite a bit of debate about this, but the fact of the matter is, in Targhee sheep, staple length is not a problem. Don't mess with it. Yearling weight, this is the one everybody likes to talk about. Katahdin breeders Targhee breeders were quite concerned about their sheep getting too big and the high maintenance cost of their ewes. And our analysis said that was a valid concern. So how do you keep ewes from getting too big? You place negative weight on late growth. Yearling weight. Well, that didn't go over great at first. We like those big lambs as yearlings. Do you like big ewes? No. How you want to get both of those things? Huh? The other thing that you have to understand is we were trying to make really heavy weaning weights that did not go with really heavy adult ewe weights. Well, that's impossible. I can't do that. But by using this breeding objective, I can moderate the increases in adult ewe weight while we're pushing on the weaning weight. This breeding objective does not reduce yearling weight. It just keeps it from going up as fast as it would have gone. And I'll use this conversation and this analysis to make the point that your intuition about what a breeding objective should be will only take you so far till you actually do the math and do the accounting to see what really will cost you money and what really will make you money. It's awfully tempting to take all these things and make them all quote unquote better, bigger, finer. We don't necessarily always want to do that. I appreciate Tom's discussion. Here's the other one I want to emphasize a little bit. You know, I said that breeding objectives can change, right? They change over time. And they also change in terms of how prolific the sheep are. When we did the breeding objective for Targhee, the average lamb drop on a whole flock basis for the Targhee NSIP flocks was about 1.7. And if I look at increasing that lamb drop, that gives me a pretty substantial increase in what in this case is weight of lamb weaned per ewe exposed. But when I go to 2, which is about where I think a whole flock, Katahdin flock might be, this curve is flattening off pretty fast. And despite what Brad said, who had the Katahdin and the poly pretty close together, if I think where I think the poly lives, there's little, if any, need to increase litter size unless you're really good at keeping triplets alive. And some of you may be really good at keeping triplets alive, but there's lots of precedent in range sheep for a 50% death loss in triplet lambs. Everybody's not as good as you might be at keeping triplets alive. The station is quite good at keeping triplets alive, but it still gets pretty close to that 50 or 60% survival rate for the triplet lambs. So the value of percent lamb crop in these Targhees, when they were at 1.7, might drop by a third or a half if they were sitting at 2 lambs weaned per ewe. So it is a dynamic thing. Tom went through the Katahdin Youth Productivity Index here in the middle. I presented a little differently. It's exactly the same thing. The main focus, number of lambs weaned, because we consider this index to be appropriate for a maternal breed. Maternal weaning weight, important. Weaning weight, a little less important in a breed like Katahdin, which are out on generally forage-based production, limited creek feeding. The milk from that mother is pretty important. They also tend to be weaned early, have higher prolificacy. The milk from that mother does a pretty good job in keeping lambs alive. I also thank Tom for explaining why number of lambs weaned has a big plus, the number of lambs born has a little minus. I want to re-emphasize it because it's not intuitive. If I got number of lambs weaned at 2, I could easily have number of lambs born at 2 or 3. I'm going to give the lamb who has 2 lambs born and 2 lambs weaned a little bit of credit compared to the ewe that has 3 lambs born and 2 lambs weaned. I don't want that lamb to die, but I'm going to give a ton more credit to the ewe that has 3 lambs born and 3 lambs weaned. She's still the big winner. I put this up here because I think it has implications for Western range production. Why do you like Katahdins? Do you like them because they're moderately sized, fairly low maintenance, fairly easy keeping? Or do you like them in spite of the fact? Would you like them to be big old Columbia looking ewes? Would that just make you feel better? And the implications of that is, if the industry out here says we want bigger lambs, are you willing to maybe give up a little youth productivity to get bigger lambs? Or at least balance your emphasis more toward bigger lambs and less toward really productive, easy keeping ewes? Is that a trade-off you're comfortable with, willing to make, just hate to do? It's a fair question, I think I know the answer. I think the Katahdin's excellence in youth productivity is their strength in addition to their parasite resistance, which may or may not be important to you out here. But that's a choice you get to make, and you might be asked to make if you want to really have inroads into the Western range. Okay, so before we go on then, if you're going to fit the stereotypical Western range feedlot market production system, you may need to think about getting more growth in your Katahdin sheep. You may need to think about a little emphasis on muscling you may need, based on the hands that went up, to think about whether fecal egg count is something you need to emphasize. These are questions only you can really answer. But I think some of the comments Whit made, some of the things that Brett is hoping to do with the Katahdin sheep here on the station, and hopefully some of the ideas I've been able to share with you will help you make those decisions. I want to talk a little bit about coat before we quit. Try not to take too long. I consider this a pretty typical A coat in the mid-Atlantic states where I live. It's not a slick Caribbean hair coat, but I don't see any obvious wool, but it's still a thick coat, isn't it? It's a pretty thick kind of a coat. Now contrast, whoops. Oh, and we know that the Katahdin has type definitions for coat, A, B, and C. I'm assuming you're all relatively familiar with those, probably very familiar with those. The A coat, essentially no unshed woolly fiber. So this girl's probably an A coat, I would think. Coat type measured, I think, between April and October. So a ewe that grows some wool in the winter and sheds it off can still be an A coat. B and C has a little bit of wool hanging out. The double A coat, which was a thing a few years ago, was the ewe that has that wool-free coat all year round. And that, as I understand it, is no longer a thing for the Katahdin Hair Sheep International. People might talk about it, but sheep are not being graded for this double A coat. They still are by the Canadian system. Don't know that I fully understand that, but it's their choice. I want to compare that now to the true hair sheep from the Caribbean that are the ancestors of the Katahdin. Here's the St. Croix. These are sheep in Virginia, but they are relatively purebred St. Croix, Virgin Islands white hair sheep. Probably the closest thing we have to the hair sheep ancestor of the Katahdin. And you see, there's a little bit of thickness about some of those coats, but I think this was probably an April breeding for fall lambing. Those coats are a little less thick, and the ewes are uniformly pretty clean. But these sheep in Virginia are still different from these Caribbean hair sheep in Trinidad, in the tropics, where the coats are very clean, very short, stay this way all year round, as you might expect. This is a coat that one would have to ask if you would like to transplant into north central Montana. Not sure about that. I'm also not sure that these sheep couldn't grow some wool if they felt like they needed to. I mean, I think many of you have seen goats that will thicken up their hair coat in the winter, not just cashmere goats, milk goats, brush goats. When it gets cold, they'll thicken up. And I think we'll see some of the same things. Some other examples, these sheep on top are Brazilian Santa Inez. These are now a pretty typical hair sheep, but they were derived as a hair wool cross using the Italian Bergamasca wool sheep. And you see the girl on the left has a little bit of wool down her back, a little bit of wool on her hips, even in tropical Brazil, and she's been in tropical Brazil as a breed a long time. To contrast that, I've got a 3/4 St. Croix yearling ewe in Virginia, and she's 3/4 St. Croix, not 3/4 Katahdin, but she's got already that sort of thick hair coat look that I think is fairly typical of the Katahdin breed. That suggests by the time you get to a 7/8 Katahdin, you ought to be able to get something that looks quite a bit like this. This is a shot from Sedalia. I know these sheep are clipped, but they actually produced a nicer, I was going to use and emphasize the one in front, but then I realized the hair is a nice example of that sheep in the back that, even though it's probably been clipped to clean it up a little bit, has a woolly coat or a very thick hair coat. So I think we need to think about what kind of sheep or if a different sheep is needed in the mid-Atlantic states and in the Mountain West. How many of you have most of your sheep with an A coat? How many of you have quite a number, a reasonable number of ewes with B and C coats? Yeah. Wonder which one would be best in a big range flock in the northern Rockies. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that in the early years of the Katahdin breed, there were a number of breeders in Alberta that were quite happy with their Katahdin sheep. I don't know much about what they looked like, because that was probably 20 or 25 years ago when I was aware of them, but they were doing pretty well. Now, how do you establish substantial numbers of commercial Katahdin ewes in a rangeland production system? And what kind of sires do you use to make the market plans? And what are they going to look like? Now, this is a shot of some St.Croix Suffolk ewes we made at Virginia Tech. These are mostly first-generation crosses. I have a feeling this little gal in the middle is a yearling second-generation cross. We did have some of those ewes that shed clean, like she did in the summer. But we had a lot more that looked like the rest of these girls. One of the problems I see in using the Katahdin as a commercial rangeland ewe is, how do you start? Because if you start by using Katahdin rams in a pre-existing Rambouillet flock, except for the color, you're going to get a ton of this. Some breeders won't be bothered by it, commercial breeders. Some commercial breeders will be bothered by it. Big gobs of wool falling off in the right places, down the front. See the shoe on the side and on the back, along the underline. So you're probably not going to have to shear, but this is what the crossbreds are going to look like. So how do you get started? I'm not unhappy with the ewe. This Suffolk Katahdin ewe, yeah, I'll take that ewe. I can make some lambs with her. But I've still got this shedding issue. So how do we start? This ewe is probably a polypay type crossed on a St. Croix with the lamb sired by Suffocks. She's still pretty woolly, right? She'll drop off a little more of that wool as the summer progresses, but not all of it. Again, is this the way we're going to move forward? Or are we going to move forward by selling or breeding straight-bred Katahdins for the commercial rangeland industry? And if we want to sell purebred Katahdin ewe lambs, can you make enough to matter? I don't know the answer to that, but I bet it's a challenge. These little guys, by the way, interesting. There's actually, if you start counting feet and look at the direction the hocks go, there's 3 of them. There's one back there in the back. We let these ewes raise these 3 Suffolk-Sired lambs for weaning at 60 days. Most of them lived, but they were kind of ugly because they were hungry. They could literally lift the shoe up off the ground by the time they were about 6 or 8 weeks old. It was just, boom, I want to eat. So we weaned them, and they didn't look too great. And in about 4 weeks, these guys just erupted. They were pretty good market lambs. So you can do it, but it takes a little bit of thought. So let's talk about how you might put together a range flock of Katahdin sheep. So let's say we needed, let's say we had 1,000 lambings by Katahdin ewes. And that would produce about 750 ewe lambs per year. And it looks like my numbers to do this were really pretty consistent with the numbers we've seen up to now. You're going to need to keep about 30% as replacements in your flock. It's probably your responsibility to cull about the bottom quarter before you offer them for sale as replacement ewe lambs. But some of them are going to be small, and you want to sell good ones. So you're going to have about 225 surplus ewe lambs for sale if you start with 1,000 recorded lambings by Katahdin ewes. You're culling pretty hard. You're keeping 30% as replacements. You might have about 100 cull ewes that you would be happy to sell to someone that don't have really problems. They just don't belong in your seed stock. So you might be able to shoot out 325 surplus breeding ewes from a baseline of 1,000 recorded lambings. And if you were selling those to a commercial breeder, you'd have 325 the first year. You might add another 325 the second year. And I also assumed that he would breed those ewe lambs to Katahdins. They had a few on their own flock. So you might be at 700 by the second year. By the third year, 1,100 potential Katahdin replacements. So you could turn that 1,000 ewe flock into a hair sheep flock, or Katahdin flock. So you need to start with about 1,000 recorded lambings. Over 3 years, you could get a flock of around 1,100 Katahdin breeding ewes. And after that, you're going to need about 250 replacements a year, and that 1,000 recorded lambings could cover that. That's one band of sheep, right? One band of sheep. Now, I'd be curious, I'll just get an idea, we're about to be finished. How many of you have more than 500 ewes? How many of you have more than 250? How many of you have more than 100? Up to 3. How many of you have more than 50? How many of you have less than 50? How are you going to get these ewes for the sky ewes? How are we going to do it? And I'm asking that I'm asking that as a challenge for y'all, and as a challenge for us all to think about. How are you going to move toward a hair sheep-based range sub-industry, something more than a flock or two? How are we going to get that done? And part of the problem with getting that done is those crossbred ewes I showed you. It may be a little bit difficult to get someone who's got a flock of pretty decent Rambouillet ewes to move to the Rambouillet equivalent of this for a while. It just may be difficult to get that done. I think it's something we have to think about. Now, here's one option. This pyramid was designed to look at the impact that you might have for NSIP polypay flocks on an industry. So if you can produce 1,000 lambings within the elite nucleus flocks, and we'll assume we're in this room because you're here, must be. If you can multiply those some way, you can maintain a ram band with your 1,000 lambings of maybe 850 purebred rams. That's assuming you use the rams for about 2.5 years each and just replace the ones you got to replace. That would maintain about a 43,000 ewe multiplier. But there's no basis for that multiplier flock in the industry that I know about for a hair sheep multiplier. So you got to figure out if there are going to be flocks like those shedding hair wool mixed flocks, or whether you can reasonably increase your numbers. If you could do this, you could support a breeding population of about 70,000 commercial ewes. But I don't know how you create the middle. And I say that just to challenge all of us to think about it. Not that you can't, not that you shouldn't try, but to figure out how you do it, how you really have the impact you want. You know, if you have polypay sheep and you want to convince a Rambouillet breeder to use polypay rams and keep some poly Rambouillet rams back as replacements, well, that's a pretty low cost thing. Yeah, your wool quality goes down a little bit, but they're still white-faced sheep. You can still run your wool through the normal wool channels. But to me, this is the challenge. Can you get big enough, fast enough, or develop a strategy that the few commercial range breeds will accept to get those flocks out there in something other than a sort of specimen flock basis? I don't know. I think there's lots of things to think about in terms of doing that. And with that, well done, I'm ready for questions. I'm ready for your ideas. Let me see if I think we're done. Let's make sure. Yeah. And darn, if I didn't do the wool sheep slide to do it. It's a real challenge. The other thing I think we'll talk about maybe in the discussion a little bit is what are the mechanisms you can use? If you wanted to get 5 bands of Katahdin sheep out there, is the only way to do it to make crossbred Katahdins, but you're not going to get the same acceptance as if you could walk Katahdin sheep out there. Get a bang from your own flocks. Okay, questions, comments? Yes.
What if the range flock bought 250 head of ewe lambs and ran them separately and bred them back to registered Katahdin?
Well, I did
And
include
build his herd as well as mine. If he bought 250 this year, he buys another 250 next year.
Well, I did actually include that in that calculation. Because he was going for 3 years at least, he was going to devote all of his purchase Katahdins to making Katahdin replacements. And then after 3 years, he was going to default to probably making crossbred lambs. We didn't get to that. We should have gotten that more. Are these going to be purebred Katahdin range sheep?
I think only until it gets his close to the number that he wants to run.
I agree. And now I did include him doing that for 3 years to get his flock.
And he would be using some of these smaller groups of people to supply him, as well as he would supply himself.
Yeah. You see on the bottom line there, he needs about 250 replacement ewes a year to keep going. And I think that's much more reasonable to be able to buy those from hopefully an expanding base of Katahdin breeders.
I don't think he can take it, just throw it in and say, here, I'm going to have a hair sheep out there. He's going to have a best sheep out there. It still gets on its back, still has other troubles, doesn't have the characteristics of sheep.
Well, that's going to be the question, is whether those hair wool, obvious hair wool crosses are going to fit in well. Now, I think when the lambs go to the feedlot, as I understand pretty typical management, that if you were to take the Katahdin type ewe, cross them on a Suffolk buck, you would get some lambs that are going to have a very clearly mixed hair wool coat. But if you sell those lambs into a feedlot, they're going to get sheared probably into the feedlot. And so that's not really going to be an issue. And I think in order to get the lamb weights you're going to need, that you're going to have to probably not be seeing purebred Katahdins as the market lamb on the range. I think they're still going to be crossed on Suffolk or something like it, or you're going to have to find a white lamb market.
You don't think that he will get a big enough improvement in his early and wean numbers to offset the size?
I think I'm going to get both. I'm going to get the number born and weaned from the Katahdin mother, And I'm gonna bring in something like a Suffolk ram to make that thing fit the feedlot, stereotypical feedlot weights. And I'm gonna have lambs that have a hair wool coat. If we take them to the feedlot, shear them into the feedlot, I don't think.
What's gonna happen though after, now that he's up there at that level, that he's doing, he's gonna have to be all careful, he's gonna backslide, back into the water.
No, because he's not gonna keep those ewe lambs. You can't keep those ewe lambs. You have to either buy fresh ewe lambs, or you have to devote a portion of your flock to breeding straight to top.
And maybe that is.
And if they're, as good as we hope they are, you have to do that. I mean, Rambouillet guys don't turn into Suffolk flocks.
That's true.
Because they know they've got to have that sheep. But it's a challenge, and nothing wrong with the challenge. And you may find 2 or 3 breeders who are willing to have Suffolk Katahdin, Rambouillet Katahdin sheep for a while, just to get in. But a lot of them are going to look at those hair wool mixed coats, and they're going to get embarrassed by their neighbors and feel bad. It's just not going to go. Yes, ma'am.
So in the beginning, you were talking about the shearing cost of everything. I mean, when you said your crossbred to the
Feedlot?
to the feedlot, I mean, they're gonna have to pay the cheap shearing, and it's gonna be junk. And they're gonna have to, I mean, what are they gonna do with it? I mean, what's the cost?
Well, they're going to shear those lambs anyway. I don't know what the value is of that lamb's wool in the feedlot, Brett.
Well, I think generally they won't shear. I mean, they'll take them straight, in the feedlot, they'll grow them straight. Unless I misunderstood the question, if they take those weaned lambs in, they'll take them straight through. And then those pellets just won't. They'll be down at the bottom level.
They won't trim that on a set of Rambouillet lambs.
Well, now the Rambouillet is different.
Okay. What about a black-faced Rambouillet? Black-faced Rambouillet for the Suffolk-Sired.
Well, still, they'll take, I mean, they're gonna work with those pellets with the slop.
But they're not going to shear them into the lot.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. No, they will shear them. They'll shear them late winter usually. They need at least 60 days regrowth on the pellets on the United. But I was thinking more of the ones we're going to slaughter. Not
So your gain in weight is, I mean, you're losing it on the shearing end too.
Well, before you shear off those speckle faced lambs, what they need you. I mean, you're talking 4 or 5 cents, 10 cents a pound. So that feedlot wool is, it's not worth a lot of money.
Yeah. I would think the gain you would get by marketing a Suffolk Katahdin meat lamb would way overrule the amount by still having to shear that lamb into the lot. Really. I'm not sure that's true, but see if you.
So
It's a gain you'd like to have if you could do purebred Katahdin. I think you give up so much weight you can't. That's my opinion. Or you start moving the Katahdin to being a bigger sheep. I've left that door open. I'm not going to neither walk through it nor slap it.
Well, something we see is like my market on my Katahdin weathers, which most of them seed stock producers, but I market on my weathers. I market them to a guy who runs a feedlot and he sells to high-end restaurants down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I get a good price. I just sold my January, February weathers for $3.20 a pound. And it's like, that's a good price for here.
Yeah.
But, and he paid me that same $3.20 a pound for the lambs that were weighing 90 pounds, the ones that were weighing 40. But that's the thing, the Katahdins, you won't buy anything that isn't Katahdin. So
That's then the alternative trick, if you can pull it off, is to turn that niche into a market for more sheep. And that's
and down our way, that guy is buying hundreds of them. I mean, hundreds of them.
well,
He goes to Missouri because there's not enough here that have got that. He wants to know what they're grading is on the plan. And there's 60-day adjusted weights and they're 90-day weights. And he's like, nobody hardly does it, so he has to go to Missouri and buy from some of the MoCats down there.
Well, you know, is it better to try and develop that market locally? Or to spend the extra time and effort to break into the big range block market? I don't know, I can't say. It's a big market, obviously, if you can become, you know, in the polypay level at least. But it's a market that you guys are not greatly prepared to get into, just in terms of numbers and all that. So, you know, this may be a better strategy to stay with what we might define as a niche, but an expandable niche, you know, a niche that could get big, a niche that could be consistent with the way you wish to produce sheep. And, you know, I think everything should be on the table. And we can, where the questions now, how do you want to manage it?